Hello everybody and welcome back to a brand new video. Today we're doing what if the US annexed Canada. So Monsieur Z has a good video about this. It was a video about how the US was about to get all of Canada because of one ship. The British had, funded the Confederates, had given them a ship, and there was a time where the US wanted reparations for that, and there was a possibility that Canada could have become a part of the United States. So we're going to look at a timeline where what if that happened? It's mostly going to be on the political side, kind of. And so I don't have notes for this. I should take notes, but this is going to be my first attempt at just doing it based off memory. And I'll warn you, my Canadian history isn't great. I know bits and pieces. Sorry about that. But yeah, my Canadian history, not the best as an American. So if you're Canadian, live in Canada, or just know a good chunk about Canadian politics and history, let me know down in the comments. It would be great to know. So first off, we take a look at the 1868 election. As you can see here, Toronto, Quebec, Prince Edward Island, um, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Hopefully I got those names right are states in this timeline, but they're not that big. They're like very small, but I couldn't make them small on the map. I'm sorry. So the Republicans will nominate General Ulysses Grant, who was the general, the big guy, the big boy in the Civil War, and the Democrats will nominate, I think, New York governor. It's either New York or New Jersey. Their governor, Horatio Seymour, and of course we have a Canadian who's going to run third party. He's going to be someone who's like, we don't want to be part of the U.S. We want to be our own thing. He's going to run. He'll win. I think Nova Scotia. I think that's Nova Scotia. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. It's these three little islands down here that I really don't. Do you consider these islands like these two are definitely like quote unquote islands because they're not attached to land? I don't think you would consider that one an island, but I don't. My knowledge on those three. The other provinces, I could probably tell you their names. Not those three though. I get those three mixed up. But Republican President or Republican General Ulysses Grant would defeat Democrat Governor Horatio Seymour and anti-union Congressman Joseph Howe 234 to 98 to 3 to become the 18th president. If you're wondering how I'm getting electoral votes for the Canadian provinces, I take whatever seat or how many parliament seats they have and divide by 3. That's how I'm doing it. In 1872, Republicans will renominate President Grant. However, the Liberal Republican will have a pretty stacked primary, but they'll end up nominating New York Congressman Horace Greeley. And I forgot to mention that Ulysses Grant will pick Canadian John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada, seen as the George Washington of Canada. And Horace Greeley will nominate Missouri Governor Benjamin Grace Brown. However, Greeley would die in between the election and the certification process of the Electoral College, and thus Republican President Ulysses Grant would defeat Liberal Republican Congressman Horace Greeley 286 to 122 to win re-election. I think those numbers are wrong. Oh well. In 1876, the Democrats they'll nominate, I think, New Jersey governor. No, New York governor. I'm sorry. Allergies are still affecting me quite a bit. Not as bad as a couple days ago, but but they'll nominate Samuel Tilden, and the Republicans will nominate Vice President John McDonald. Tilden will choose Indiana Governor Thomas Hendricks as running mate, and McDonald will choose Maine Senator James Blaine as his running mate. And Democrat Governor Samuel Tilden would defeat Republican Vice President John McDonald 243 to 185 to become the 19th president. I haven't been mentioning what these people do because it's not going to be until like later on in the timeline where things are different. Okay, so if you're interested to know what these people do, just look it up. I've, talked about it plenty of times. Grant really didn't do much. He was essentially the corrupt president who didn't know what he was doing. Tilden would pretty much do the exact same thing Rutherford Hayes did. They really didn't have that much of a difference in policy. So the economy would be fair, of course. But in 1880, James Garfield will be nominated the Ohio congressman. He will run against President Samuel Tilden. He'll choose chair of the New York Republican Party, Chester Arthur, as his running mate. And Garfield will defeat Tilden 214 to 187 to become the 20th president. And and of course he would be assassinated. Chester Arthur would become the president. There would be an immigration tax on the Chinese. Yes, or just say immigration tax in general. The Chinese immigration tax will come at a later date. I'll get to that here in a second. 1884, the Democrats would nominate New York Governor Grover Cleveland. The Republicans would nominate former running mate to James or John A. McDonald, Maine Senator James Blaine. Grover Cleveland would choose a Canadian as his running mate, Edward Blake, and of course Blaine would choose John Logan. I don't remember what his position was, but Democrat Governor Grover Cleveland would defeat Republican Senator James Blaine 264 to 209 to become the 22nd president. Again, Grover Cleveland would do exactly what he did IRL uh, in this term. And we have another change here. Republicans would nominate Indiana Senator Benjamin Harrison, and he will choose Levi Morton as his running mate. But due to the introduction of Canadian provinces, and in my opinion, Cleveland would do very well here. Cleveland would end up narrowly winning re-election, 4 electoral vote differences, and he would barely win the popular vote. He'd be very close to losing it, but Cleveland would end up winning in just in general. And this is where Cleveland would increase the immigration tax, but specifically for Chinese immigrants. He would also sign the Page Act, which would restrict immigration for Chinese women. In 1892, the Democrats would nominate Vice President Edward Blake. Republicans would nominate UK Ambassador Whitelaw Reid. I think that's correct. And of course, we have populist Congressman James Weaver from Iowa. And Democrat Edward Blake would go on to win this election, defeating Whitelaw Reid and James Weaver 324 to 163 to 22 to become the 23rd president. Going on to 1896, let me talk about what Blake does first. Blake is kind of the hey, I'm here. He doesn't really do much. However, he does deal with a big, rebellion from Native Canadians, or just, I guess, Native Americans now up in the northern states, or, well, the provinces. It's going to be confusing. The northern states, the big northern states, so he has that to deal with. In 1896, William McKinley, who was the running mate of Whitelaw Reid, he will win the nomination, which is a bad idea most of the time, but it works out this time. And Edward Blake is is given a primary challenger in William Jennings Bryan, which, if you're given running a primary challenge, a major one, you end up losing re-election. That's what happens. McKinley would choose Garrett Hobart as his running mate, and Edward Blake will stick with Adlai Stevenson as his. And Republican governor, the governor of Ohio, William McKinley, would go on to defeat President Edward Blake 310 to 213 to become the 24th president. McKinley, again, does what he does IRL. There's really not much to talk about that would be different. In 1900, William McKinley renominated, no opposition, and for the Democrats, they nominate Nebraska Congressman William Bryan. However, McKinley would change his running mate to Teddy Roosevelt, the governor of New York, and Wilfrid Laurier, a Canadian, would be Jennings or Bryan's running mate. And of course, McKinley would defeat Bryan 292-226 to win re-election. McKinley would be assassinated in 1901, if I'm not mistaken, and Teddy Roosevelt would become the 25th president. And of course, he would win renomination without a hitch. He'd be very popular. He's running against New York Judge Alton Parker. Would be nice to have a President Parker, because that's my name, Parker, my first name, but it's not happening. Teddy Roosevelt would choose Charles Fairbanks as running mate, and of course, Henry Davis would be Parker's running mate. Theodore Roosevelt would squash Parker. Judge Alton Parker, 342-205 to win re-election. So Roosevelt, of course, brings progressive ideas to the presidency. He ends up being very popular. In 1908, Taft, handpicked by Teddy Roosevelt, would win the Republican nomination. He'll run against William Bryan, who is running for a third time, or second time to most non-educated voters. And Taft will have James Sherman as his running mate, and of course John Kern would be Bryan's running mate. And Taft would go on to defeat Bryan 355-205 to become the 26th president. The popularity of Teddy Roosevelt would help Taft over the finish line. Taft would sign the 17th Amendment, or not the 17th, it would be the 16th Amendment, where he does the income tax. In 1912, the hatred between Roosevelt and Taft would still happen. Wilson would become the Democrat nominee, the governor of New Jersey, and he would end up beating both Taft and Teddy, 435 to 88 to 48. Taft would, of course, win some Canadian provinces, such as the Yukon, British Columbia. I think that's Manitoba, as well as Ontario, along with Vermont and Utah. He would also win Prince Edward Island. You can't forget about them. In 1916, same matchup as before, however, a bit more closer. Wilson would defeat Charles Hughes 314-294. Again, the topic of World War I is talked about. Wilsonianism does still happen in our timeline, which leads to neoconservatism and neoliberalism, and thus Wilson will enter us in World War I, and we've got all that to worry about. In 1920, however, again, no major change here, really. Warren Harding, the senator from Ohio, would be nominated by the Republicans, and the governor of Ohio, James Cox, by the Democrats. We have the Ohio battle. There's a meme on Twitter where Ohio just rules everything. But Warren Harding would have a much larger victory over Cox, 460 to 151. He'd become the 28th president. He'd die shortly into his term, and there would be a lot of corruption that would be uncovered. He'd probably be impeached. I don't know if he would be convicted. That is, he probably would have, since politics wasn't so polarized back then. But thus, Calvin Coolidge becomes the 29th president. There's a good economy. He really doesn't do much. And he goes on to 1924 to run against John Davis and Robert La Follette. Coolidge's running mate, Charles Dawes. Davis's running mate, Charles Bryan, the brother of William Bryan, if I'm not mistaken, also the governor of Nebraska. And Thomas Crerar, don't know how to pronounce the name. He's a Canadian. He would be a congressman. He probably most likely be a governor in this timeline. But of course, Calvin Coolidge would win 416 to 168 to 27 to win a first full term or re-election, depending on what you want to use. In 1928, again, we don't really have that much change, except we have governor of Alberta in this timeline, John Brownlee, running under the Farmer Labor Party, which would pick him up steam. He gets second place in Minnesota, but he'd take away votes from Al Smith. Also, the fact that Al Smith's Catholic, which was hated during this time, sadly. Me being a Catholic, oh boy. But of course, Herbert Hoover would become the 30th president with that ease, and then of course the Great Depression hits. The Great Depression hits. Hoover's approvals tank, and of course we got Franklin Roosevelt, who would end up defeating Hoover, 500 to 112 to become the 31st president. The New Deal would start. A lot of opposition. He would try to pack the courts. That would fail. And going on to 1936, we have a five-way for the nomination. Franklin Roosevelt for the Democrats, Alf Landon win the Republican primary. We have William Aberhart, who would be the Social Credit Party, which the Prohibition Party would essentially merge with that party. Social Credit, which would be like a Christian conservative party, essentially. And excuse me. And of course, William Aberhart would lead it. He'd win the nomination. The Socialist Party, Norman Thomas, would pick up steam in the British Columbia, and he would win there. And of course, William Borah would run as an independent, saying, I'm against Alf Landon, and he would do well in the Yukon area, and he would probably get second in his home state of Idaho. But due to the massive vote splitting, as well as Alf Landon really not campaigning, Franklin Roosevelt would win 586 electoral votes to Alf Landon's 8, to Aberhart's 5, to Thomas's 5, to Borah's 3. So 5 people won electoral votes. Man, imagine that Wikipedia page, that info box, imagine. And again, the New Deal would continue going on to 1940. We have probably one of my favorite elections, the 1940 election, still happening between Roosevelt and Wilkie. Roosevelt would change his VP from John Garner to William Wallace, and he would go on to beat Wendell Willkie 519 to 85. He would do very well in the Canadian states, only losing the Yukon state. In 1944, Thomas Dewey, the now governor of New York, would run after a second attempt, choosing John Bricker, the governor of Ohio, as his running mate. Roosevelt, once again, changing his running mate, this time to Missouri Senator Harry Truman, and he would go on to defeat Dewey 502 to 102, 400 electoral vote difference, winning a fourth term. But however, he would die, and Harry Truman would take the reins to push America through World War II, which does happen still. There really isn't no change to that. Harry Truman would drop the bombs on Nagasaki and all that, And of course, another five-way election: Truman for the Democrats, Dewey for the Republicans. Dixiecrats would still happen with Strom Thurmond. The Social Credit Party would nominate Sullen or Lowe, and Socialist Norman Tomlin runs again. But Truman would win 334 to 224 to 39 to 7 to 5. There you go. Truman would win his first full term, and in this term, the Cold War would essentially begin. Um, I think the Korean War would begin in this as well. The Korean War does occur. In 1952, we have a three-way race between Dwight Eisenhower, Adlai Stevenson, and Social Credit Party, once again having a major presence. This time, the entertainer Stuart Hamblin would run. Eisenhower still chooses Nixon. Stevenson, or yeah, Adlai Stevenson chooses John Sparkman, and Enoch Holtwick would be the Social Credit nominee. And Enoch Holtwick is was like a third party. I think he was actually Stuart Hamlin's running mate IRL. But Adlai Stevenson would do very well in the Canadian states, but Eisenhower would still end up winning 442 to 173 to 5 to become the 33rd president. Going on 1956, and I think in between this time the Korean War would end, but or if not then, now. Adlai Stevenson, once again, we have that rematch. However, the Social Credit Party comes back with Gerald Smith, who was a Nazi sympathizer. And of course, we have a socialist congressman by the name of Major Coldwell, a Canadian who would, of course, be a congressman now. Socialist Party would have more of a presence. We'd probably have a lot more third party presence in this country due to the fact that we are having multiple third party candidates win electoral votes. But Republican President Dwight Eisenhower would, of course, defeat all of his opponents 457 to 156, 5 to 5 to win re-election. A recession would occur in this term, which would hurt the Republicans in the next election. But in 1960, this is a very close election right here. Again, despite even with the Canadian provinces, a still close election. Nixon v. Kennedy. However, Nixon doesn't choose Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. He chooses John Diefenbaker, who is a Canadian, former prime minister. Kennedy does beat Nixon 309 to 306, so the conspiracy theories of this being a stolen election will still occur. Kennedy becomes the 34th president, fights for civil rights, will get assassinated. Lyndon B. Johnson becomes the 35th president. We go into Vietnam. In 1964, we still have the Johnson v. Goldwater. Johnson would win to win re-election, choosing Hubert Humphrey as his running mate. In 1968, we have Nixon running against Pierre Trudeau, the Attorney General under Lyndon B. Johnson. He would beat out Hubert Humphrey narrowly. And we still have George Wallace in the presence, taking away votes from Trudeau, which causes Nixon to end up beating both Trudeau and Wallace to become the 36th president. Again, Watergate still happens. The EPA is still established. In 1972, Nixon would go on to run against George McGovern and the socialist congressman David Lewis, which at this time, the Socialist Party, they're starting to get a bad rep because, socialist is a bad word, so they're thinking of a rebrand. But Nixon would cruise to re-election, losing all but four states, or winning all but four states, 578 to 41 to 10 to win another term. Again, he will resign due to Watergate, and Gerald Ford would become the 37th president, and of course another three-way race. Not really, but Jimmy Carter would end up defeating Gerald Ford and a socialist author, Peter Camijo, who wins the Northwest Territories, and Ford being unpopular for, pardoning Nixon. However, the economy is good, so that kind of helps him a little bit, but Carter still ends up winning. Of course, with Carter, we have the energy crisis, the oil crisis, the Iran hostage crisis, and the Republicans nominate Ronald Reagan, and the Socialists nominate Ed Broadbent, again doing very well in the Northwest Territories. Ed Broadbent is a Canadian, IRL, and of course there's really nothing changed about Reagan. We still get a good economy with a slight recession in the beginning, a massive tax cuts. The Iran-Contra affair still occurs. In 1984, we have a rematch between Reagan and Mondale. There is no Socialist Party in here. Reagan still mollywops Mondale, only losing Montana. He wins 619 electoral votes to Mondale's 13. In 1988, we saw Bush versus Dukakis. However, the Socialist Party nominates an activist, Lenora Fulani. who was under the United Alliance Party. I could be wrong, but Bush would still go on to win another term. The whole "don't read my lips," no tax cuts still happen, even though no new taxes. However, he does do new taxes. We go into a recession. Taxes are brought in. However, the Gulf War still occurs in the beginning of his term, so there he does have that. In 1992, we have the greatest election to not happen. I guess the greatest election to not have the right person win. I guess. Clinton v. Bush versus Perot. Perot actually wins electoral votes this time, winning Yukon, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. And however, Clinton still becomes the 41st president, defeating Bush and Perot. And we do get like an assault weapons ban. We get the White Waters, the White. I don't remember. It's White something scandal. His scandal does come out before the Monica Lewinsky scandal. In 1996, we have another five-way race between Clinton, Dole, Perot. The Bloc Québécois becomes a party when they nominate Lucien Bochard. And of course, the New Democrats, formerly the Socialist Party, the New Democrat Party, Audrey McLaughlin, would win their primary. And we have a big clusterfuck on the board. The Bloc Québécois now becoming an official party. And of course, Bill Clinton mollywops this map, winning big time, winning re-election. And this is where we get the whole impeachment thing, Monica Lewinsky scandal. And in the 2000 election, a three-way race. The Reform Party does very well this election. Congressman Stockwell Day wins the nomination, and he ends up winning British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan on this map, while Bill Clinton ends up winning the rest of the Canadian provinces, or Al Gore, excuse me. But Al Gore does become president due to those Canadian provinces, and he beats George Bush and Stockwell Day to become the 42nd president. So we start having a change. We don't go into Iraq, however, we do go into Afghanistan post 9/11, and of course, since we're not in Iraq, Al Gore focuses on the environment and all that. Focuses on environment, while Bush focused on education, but we have a more focus on environment in this term. And in 2004, Al Gore will be facing off against Arizona Senator John McCain, and the Bloc Québécois nominates, I'm going to butcher this name, Gilles Giuseppe, butchered. McCain chooses former Virginia Governor Jim Gilmore as his running mate. However, Gore ends up mollywopping McCain, winning 372 electoral votes to 251 to the Bloc Québécois' 25, as the Bloc Québécois does very well in Quebec. And of course, we have a continuation of environmental policies and all that. We might see tax cuts because Gore did support some form of tax cuts for the low and middle classes, just not the upper class. Now we go on to 2008. The Great Recession does happen under Al Gore, and the Republicans nominate Congressman Stephen Harper. He will win the Republican nomination and run against Senator Barack Obama. And the New Democrats nominate Congressman Cynthia McKinley out of Georgia. And McKinley would destroy both of these candidates. He would win big time, becoming the 43rd president. And here we would see a bunch of tax cuts. We'd see like economic stimulus. Typically your neocon way for that. The economy essentially bounces back about a month later than it does IRL, but we don't know that. But we don't know that's bad, so people are like, they're happy about Stephen Harper. Whoop, whoop. In 2012, Hillary Clinton, the senator from New York, becomes the Democrat nominee. However, she turns off, the far left of the liberal wing. So Jack Layton ends up, running big time, gets a big boost, and Stephen Harper ends up beating Hillary Clinton by around 3 points in the popular vote, winning 314 electoral votes, 306-28. We probably see, same thing with the wars that we saw with Obama. We probably wouldn't see any form of Obamacare or Harper Care. If we did, it would be like a private system, some sort. But, an uneventful term in 2012. It would mostly be congressional gridlock between Harper and the Democrats. In 2016, the Democrats narrowly nominate businessman Donald Trump over Andrew Cuomo and Bernie Sanders. The New Democrats actually start to merge with the Democrats, so the Democrats are a bit more far left, or you would think, before Donald Trump showed up. And the Republicans nominate Vice President Mike Huckabee, who is Stephen Harper's running mate, and Trump would mollywop Huckabee. Trump would choose Steve Bullock, the governor of Montana, as his running mate, and Huckabee would choose Senator Ted Cruz. So we would kind of see a Tea Party, libertarian neocon, as well as a mix of Christian conservatism in the Republican Party. Kind of a weird mishmash while we see the Democrats turn to like a left-wing nationalist. So whatever Trump did in his term IRL, he pretty much does the same thing because he essentially did what, a Democrat, moderate Democrat would have done, an anti-establishment and all that. And of course, 2020, COVID still happens. The Republicans nominate South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, who chooses Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker as her running mate, and she would go on to defeat Donald Trump very, very narrowly. We still get the whole "Stop the Steal" and all that, which leads to January 6th and all that, and of course that leads up to today, where Haley probably has a pretty abysmal approval rating. So, how did you guys think of this video? Did you like it? Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to go follow my Twitter at Chaotic Politics. This is the Chaotic One saying peace.